I hope you're enjoying my YouTube channel, Rick Surowicz Watercolor. Did you know that subscribers to my mailing list sometimes receive early access to my YouTube videos before they're released to the public? It's also the best way to receive the latest information about my videos, courses, workshops, as well as coupons and giveaways. It doesn't cost anything to sign up, and right now I'm giving new subscribers exclusive access to my video, How to Avoid Blossoms and Backwash. Dealing with blossoms and backwash can be one of the most frustrating parts of learning how to paint with watercolor. Don't make this critical mistake with your watercolors. Learn to avoid blossoms and backwash in your watercolor painting. Sign up now for access to my exclusive video that shows you how. To sign up and receive exclusive access to this video, How to Avoid Blossoms and Backwash, click on the exclamation in the top right corner, or you can find the link in the description of this video. This is my narrated step-by-step tutorial for my painting Holiday Snow. I often start my videos by comparing my reference photo and my painting side by side. However, in this instance, I didn't use a reference photo. Instead, I used thumbnail sketches that I did in my sketchbook. And rather be guided by a reference photo, I was guided by more of a theme. I wanted to have evergreens and snow, and I wanted it to feel holiday-like so that it's something that can be captured and used in a Christmas card. These are some of the sketches that I did in my sketchbook to try and capture the theme that I was after. If you don't use a sketchbook, I highly recommend it. It's a great place for problem solving, and there's fewer barriers to creativity. When you're trying to learn something, I always feel it's a good idea to have what I call a developmental roadmap. And if you don't keep a sketchbook and are not in a habit of working in a sketchbook, it's something I would recommend that you put on your developmental roadmap. This is another page in the sketchbook. This time it has value studies. And once again, if this isn't something that is a habit for you, it's a good thing to do. You can, again, do a lot of problem solving and experiment with different value patterns. So once again, this would be another thing that you could put on your developmental roadmap, doing thumbnails, doing value studies. This is the sketch that I did with a B pencil. I'm working on a quarter sheet of 140-pound cold press watercolor paper, so it's 11 inches by 15 inches. And I've drawn the major shapes, and I've indicated with a vertical line where I want to put the trees. And even though I have studies in my sketchbook, there's still some of these elements in my composition that are going to evolve through my painting process. Sometimes I'll work with masking fluid, sometimes I don't. I often use masking fluid in some of my landscapes because I like the textures, and I like to use them in winterscapes because it's a good technique to create the feeling of snow when you're working transparently. I don't use any opaque paint, so if I want to create the sensation of snow flying through the air and create some of those textures and patterns or snow laying around, I need to do it in advance in the planning stages. I need to think about that. And preserve some of the whites of the paper before I start putting paint on the paper. So for this painting, you could use masking, or you can do this composition very easily without. In this instance, I'm going to use this fine line applicator, and I'm masking where some of these kind of old dried out trees are standing. I'm just drawing those with this fine line masking fluid pen, and those will stand out later once I remove the masking fluid. And to stay with my theme and the title, I want this painting to feel like a holiday snow. So I'm going to use a splatter technique here with a masking fluid. I'm using a toothbrush and I'm splattering it kind of randomly across the composition because I want to have the feeling of being a bit of a snowy day and some snow blowing around. And this is a great way to create that feeling when working with transparent watercolor. So I'm just tapping the brush and pulling back the bristles. Those are the two main techniques I use. And before I begin this, I put soapy water on the toothbrush so that it'll clean up easier. Before I begin to paint, I'll go through the colors that I use in this painting. I use 6 different colors: sap green, royal blue, cobalt blue, pyrrole red, quinacridone rose madder, and raw sienna. I'm going to begin my painting with a large, light middle valued wash over a large area of the composition. This is a mixture of quinacridone rose madder, royal blue, and just a touch of raw sienna in there to take off some of the brightness of the color a little bit, tones it down, and drives a little bit more towards a neutral tone. And as I put this wash down, there's areas that have a little more blue in it, and there's areas where I'm putting a wash down that has a little bit more rose madder in it. And I'm using a round wash brush, but I feel like I'm laboring a little bit. I could use a bigger brush to do this. So I'm going to switch, and I'm going to use a 1-inch flat wash brush. You can see this covers much more area than the round wash brush that I was using. And I like to keep my brush strokes fresher, larger. I don't like to work with tiny little brushes and noodle away at an area. I like to make a big brush mark and just leave it. So the one thing I'll mention here is I'm not worried about individual elements in my composition at this point. I'm just thinking about this large shape of value. And this is a light middle value. It's going to dry lighter when it's completely dry. But I'm covering the whole page with a light middle value wash. I'm going to get a little darker in a few areas, but I'm not thinking about each tree branch or a rock on the ground or anything. I'm thinking about this large shape that's a value, and you can start to see the areas that are going to be left with the whitest whites in my paper because I've put this wash down as a large shape over the whole composition, and it runs from the mountain to the sky to the pieces of land and over the trees. And now I've gotten a little darker. I've put a little bit more royal blue in, a little bit more rose madder, but now I've started to work more wet and wet here as I introduce some of these slightly darker, still middle value, but has a little more color in it, just a little darker. But now you can start to see where some of the whites could be as I develop this composition. And also don't forget that I've done some masking, so there's some hidden whites that'll be revealed later when I remove that masking fluid. I've dried my paper now. You can see how much lighter it is, and now I'm going to go back in with a wash over that mountain shape in the distance. And I could have done that working wet and wet, but I wanted to have a little bit more of a hard edge for the top of that mountain. So I dried my paper, came back in and started working wet on dry. And now I'm bringing this wash down, and I want to stop short of where some of the top edges of those mounds of snow are. And because I'm working wet on dry, that I don't have to worry about that paint running down. I'm working at an incline, but that dry paper will resist the flow of the paint, and it'll just go where I've dampened the paper. Now I'm going to begin working wet and wet. That distant mountain shape is still very wet, and I'm going to come in with some blue greens and some greens, dark green tones, and start to give the indication of a distant tree line back there. And right now the color I'm putting down is a little bit raw, but I'm going to put some tones that have been grayed down just a bit on top of that. So it's going to create some soft edges here. It's kind of this blue-green to give more of a feeling of distance. So these aren't going to be as defined as what happens in the foreground. So now I'm going to come back on top of some of this. I've gone a little bit more natural with the color. I probably need to adjust that a little bit. But I've been using royal blue and sap green, and then to take that more towards a neutral tone, I add pyrrole red to that mixture. And that's what I'll use on all these trees, of a variation of ratios using royal blue, sap green, and pyrrole red primarily. And I'm going to take this line of trees all the way to the left side of the composition. From side to side, I'm envisioning this distant line of tall alpine firs. Now I'm going over top of some of the trees that I've already put down. Now keep in mind, this paper that I'm working on is still very wet, because I continue to build up layers on top of layers, and I haven't dried it. And I'm not letting it get too dry so that I have an issue with blossoms. So it's still saturated paper, and I'm putting a warmer green tone now on top of a cooler green tone. Give a suggestion that those are in front of those trees that have that cooler blue-green tone, and that are farther back. Now that I have most of that distant tree line in, I'm going to start to work some of these trees that are more in the middle ground and foreground. And I'm beginning with a light wash of rose madder with a little bit of royal blue in it. And I'm putting that light wash down. It's going to give me a wet area that has a little bit of this reddish cast to it. Then I can then introduce some of these green tones into. So it's going to, as I put those in, it's going to give me a little bit of a softer edge, because I'm actually now going back in on top of this area that I just put this light wash on. So I'm actually working wet and wet a little bit. And it's kind of a combination, because some of my brush strokes are going over dry paper, and some of them are starting in some of the area where I put that initial kind of a rose tinted wash. Now I'm going to do the same with this other tree. I'm putting down this kind of a neutral wash. It has a combination of some rose madder, some royal blue, and then I've toned that down a little bit with some raw sienna. And the area that I put that now is wet. So now I'm going to come back in with some of this green mixture and put it on top of that. So that's going to soften some of the edges, but as I mentioned with the other one, some of these brush strokes are going to be going also over dry paper. So I'll get a combination of soft edge and hard edge as I put these brush strokes in. I'll also mention that I'm getting much darker with my value here as I've moved more towards the middle and foreground. I'm just using a round brush, a number 4 round brush, and you can see I don't labor over my brush strokes. I just make quick brush marks, and then I just move on. And here I'm going to give an indication of just another tree in between these two, and then let them kind of come together in one shape at the base. I'm going to continue on with the same process over here to the left side, where I have some trees in the middle ground. So you can see this is a kind of a light red-violet wash that I'm putting down. Still using a round brush. And you can see when I make a brush stroke that I get good coverage. It's no texture. It's not a dry brush effect, because I load my brush up with, even if it's a small brush, I load it up with quite a bit of paint and water from my palette. So here again, I'm coming back in on top of that initial wash with some darker richer green tones. And here's another small tree here. So this is a little darker valued red-violet mixture. And now I'm bringing the greens in on top. So once again, I get a little bit of a combination of soft edge and hard edge. Now I'm moving more into the foreground. I'm going to paint this large tree here on the left side of the composition. And I'm not going to put down a wash of a red violet or anything initially. I'm just going to start working with my dark valued green mixture, which is royal blue, sap green with some pyrrole red in it. And I'm using this 1/2-inch flat brush. But this is in the foreground, and it's a darker value. It has harder edges. So now if you look at the relationships between these trees, and they start to hopefully start using values, start to tell a story as far as where they are in the composition with regards to foreground, middle ground, and background. This tree in the foreground is a dark value, harder edge shape. When you start to move more towards the middle ground, I tried to soften some of those edges with that initial wash. Then if you go further back, that distant tree line, you can see it's a much softer edge, less definition, and cooler. I'm going to give you an indication of a couple distant trees here. There's an area where I masked one of those dried, older, dead trees, and I want that to stand out, so I'm giving it a darker value behind it. Now I'm going to take a light mixture from my palette. It has a little bit of some of the green mixtures I've been using in it, and quite a bit of water. And I'm going to lighten that up even a little bit more. But now I'm starting to give an indication here where the part of the stream that's not frozen is with this different tone. It's contrasting the color on the snow, but it's starting to pick up the color of all the trees that are around. And I've got my 1/2-inch flat brush, so I'm bringing that from the background all the way to the foreground here. And now I've switched to a 1-inch brush because I want to get some better coverage here. So now that I have this wash down, the paper is very wet. It's saturated in that area that I just put the wash. So now I'm going to take some of this dark valued green tone using a round brush. I'm just going to drop some of that in and let that kind of filter out and soften as it starts to flow across the paper. So this is going to start to pick up the reflection, give the suggestion of the reflection of these trees into this water. So now I'm going to move to the left side here. I'm going to drop some of that value in and let some of that color again diffuse into that wet wash that I put down initially. And I'm working at about a 15 to 20 degree angle, so gravity starts to pull that paint down and let it flow in the vertical direction of the reflection. I'm going to bring this down a little farther on the right. And one of the things I'll mention is when you're painting and when you're designing your composition, don't forget to include the edges of the paper. That's part of your composition. You'll see how I'm bringing that wash down to touch the edge. And if you look on the top left, I've taken that one tree to the top of the page, and it goes off the frame of reference there. These are things you need to consider. Use your whole page. You don't want to have this little composition floating in the middle of your paper. You want to include all four edges of your composition into your painting. Now I'm going to come in with a wash of quinacridone, rose madder, and cobalt blue. It's going to be a brighter mixture than what I've been using. I could stay with a more muted palette, but I'm going to liven this up a little bit with some of these more intense violet, red violet, blue violet tones that I'm putting down. And one of the reasons I want to do this and not keep it so muted is I have the masking fluid that I've splattered on this paper, and I want to have some contrast when I remove that, because I want to be able to pick up that feeling of snow laying around. So this will help create some of that contrast that I'm after and make this feel like a holiday piece. And once again, these are big brush marks. These aren't little round brush strokes that I'm just noodling away at little details. These are just big statements with my brush. I have a round wash brush that I'm using, but don't be afraid to work with a bigger brush than what you think you need or what you're used to. It's always good to try and experiment with a different approach, and one of the things you can try, especially if you're trying to loosen up, is to work with a larger brush. I want to get a darker value here up in the foreground on this tree, so I've loaded up a very dark mixture of royal blue, sap green with some pyro red in it. And I'm using my 1/2-inch flat brush and just putting some touches of this darker value across this tree. And don't forget that branches and leaves go around a tree completely 360. They don't just hang off the sides, and you don't see a trunk sitting there from top to bottom. Part of it's covered up, part of it you'll see, but leaves go all around a tree. Now I'm going to go much darker with what's going on in this water. I'm going to strengthen that value. I want this to stand out a little bit more as this body of water. So I'm using this kind of a blue-green mixture here of royal blue and sap green. And I have my 1/2-inch flat brush, and you can see if I add a little bit more water, you can see how I get that gradation, subtle gradation of value across some of my brush strokes from one to the other. And when I'm making these brush strokes, one of the things I think about is direction, and the water lays flat and ripples, and then you have the vertical reflection. So as I develop this, I'll try and capture both of those elements, some of the horizontal nature of the flatness of the water and the ripples and how they are, but also realize that the reflections are vertical in nature. I put some of this back here and sharpen some of these edges a little bit with a strong contrast and hard edge, and give a better definition of where the land ends and where the water begins. Now I'm going to go a bit stronger with these shadowed areas. I want a stronger value here, and I've added quite a bit of royal blue to this mixture. It's royal blue with quinacridone, rose madder, and now I'm starting to deepen where the shadowed pockets are based on the contour of the land. Bring some of that into several areas here in the foreground primarily, And remember, there's no reference photo for this. This is just something that I've created in my sketchbook using black and white thumbnail sketches and then black and white value studies. So just have a little bit of fun with this as I paint this. I could have also have done some color studies in my sketchbook. So that's just another problem solving tool, another way to use your sketchbook. Do thumbnails, sketches, do value studies, do color studies. Now I'm going to take even a darker mixture, and this is a lot of royal blue primarily, which is very dark. So I've added some water to it, but it's still a very dark wash that I'm putting down using my flat brush and trying to indicate some of the horizontal nature of these flat planes and defining the edge a little bit more. I'm going to work around the painting a bit with a dark value, just using a number 4 round brush. And here I'm giving indication of some of the trunks, and then just some crisp lines coming off some of the trees, off the green areas of the trees. You can see, just put in just a hint, just to give an indication that there's a trunk there. Now I've switched to a liner brush here, a number 1 liner brush, and I'm just putting in some of these dried out trees that stand here in some of these wooded areas. And this time I'm using a dark value. Before I started, I used my masking fluid to draw some of these, and there'll be a light value when I remove it. But now I'm putting in some of the darker value shapes here, and I think they help provide interest to the composition. And I'm going to add a couple more on the left side here. So what's driving me there is just I think a given area could stand a little bit more activity or another shape, and I like to put these in. Again, here I'm just using this number 1 rigger brush, just making some strokes to give an indication of some branches coming off this old dried tree. And I try to vary the heights of them, and I try and vary the spacing of them. You don't want them all to look the same. Now I'm going to continue on with this dark value and using my number 1 rigger brush. But this time I'm just going to use it to use line to help describe some of the shapes, some of the elements of this composition. You can see here, just putting a touch of a line here can indicate an edge, and it can show where 2 planes come together. And I'm going to use this just in some of the different spots across my composition where I want to shore up an edge or give some interest. And I think line is something people don't think about enough. It's a good design element to include in your composition. Provides a lot of interest. So here you see I'm just helping to indicate the edge of where the slope of that hill comes and hits the frozen edge of the water. I want to bring some of this into the foreground because it's closer to you, and you're gonna see some of these edges are gonna be clearer to you because they're closer to you in the foreground. So you can see just indicating some breaks in the snow and the ice, helping to find edge. And you can see this is a very dark value. And here when I'm doing this, I'm working wet on dry. I'm going to take a dark value here and again help define a little bit more the edge and make some of these areas more a dark shape. Some of them are a little too busy, so I'm going to make this shape a little bigger of an even value. Now I've completely dried my paper. I'm going to use a rubber cement pickup eraser, and I'm going to remove that masking fluid. Now you can start to see some of that white sparkle up here. This is a technique that I think works really well for this application. Now I like to work with transparent watercolor, so this is a technique that gives me this texture and this quality I'm after. If you work with opaques, you could just splatter something at the end, but I like working with a fresh white paper and transparency. I like the way some of that snow feels like it's laying on that tree. And I just think it's a nice effect, and I have that nice holiday snow feel that I was after. One of the last things I'm going to do is I remove that masking that was put on with a fine line pen to indicate these dried trees. So now I'm not going to leave them just white. I'm going to put just a light wash of a violet, red violet, blue violet on top of them. And I'm going to put a white mat on this to get a good look. And there you have my painting, Holiday Snow. If you haven't already, you can click on the box in the top right corner to subscribe to my email channel. You can click on the box in the bottom right corner to subscribe to my YouTube channel. There's no charge for either of these. I hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, I appreciate your comments, likes, and shares, and thank you for watching.